All right, so we'll get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I wanted to take this opportunity just to walk everyone through the slide deck and the speaking notes that go with it, just so everyone's messages are consistent at their regional meetings and to answer any questions that anyone might have before the regional meetings take place. So to get started, so the first slide is just a welcome and introductions. There have been some regional meetings that have taken place already in Halifax and Chignecto, and at some of those meetings there would be an icebreaker activity at the small group tables just to let people talk to each other and introduce each other. So feel free to do that if you think that that would be appropriate for the group at your meeting. But otherwise, you can introduce yourself and anyone from else from the regional center or the department who might be there at the meeting. So on the agenda slide, no need to spend a lot of time here, just to give people a sense of what we'll be covering at the meeting. So they can see it's a fairly full agenda, but at the meetings I've been to, it is doable within an hour and a half to a 2-hour timeline, allowing time for people to have small group discussions as well. So the first slide there are around the Education Act. So the main message to come from this slide is that in the new Education Act, the section on SACs has been significantly reduced. And what has happened is most of the items that were included in the previous act are now covered by the ministerial regulations. So the notes on this slide just essentially detail that and say that in the previous act there was information on the establishment of councils, the composition of the council, and the duties of the council, and that those items are all now covered in the ministerial regulations. And the new act, I don't think this was in the previous act, but it does say that it allows for the formation of a regional advisory council. So that would be an advisory council for more than one school. So it's worth noting that as well. The slide on the ministerial regulations. So what's important for this slide is to note that they are no longer called letters of agreement. They're called school advisory council agreements. And because of that, every SAC will now need to update their agreements because they're no longer called letters of agreement. And in the new SAC agreement, it's the regional executive director that will sign as opposed to the school board. So that's worth noting. As well, the composition of SACs. So this has, at the meetings I've been to, this can be sometimes confusing for the participants, but essentially what the composition, the note there is that now SACs have the permission to vary their membership on a temporary basis to increase the diversity of the membership. So essentially what that is saying is that once an SAC is formed, if they look around the table and they see that they're a fairly homogeneous group and that maybe there's a group from the school population that's not really represented around the table, and they want to go out and recruit an additional member to speak to that for that community, they have the freedom to do that. And if that sets them over their 1/3 rule, that's okay. So currently, SACs are supposed to not have parents or staff make up more than 1/3 of the composition, or community members make up more than 1/3 of the composition of the SAC. So a temporary variance allows them to go over the 1/3 or to violate the 1/3 rule to improve their diversity to represent the school community. And it's a temporary variance, meaning that they can do it for that school year. If they want to maintain that variance going into the next school year, they can capture that in their School Advisory Council agreement. We had the question come, well, if we add an additional parent member and we want to maintain that, can we do that? Can we keep that permanently? And the answer is yes, they can if they put it in their agreement and it's agreed upon by the regional center, the FAC, and the department. So, so long as that additional member that they're adding or members is there to increase the diversity, then I think that's a fair justification. That's what it's intended for. It's really about ensuring that the FAC is representative of the school community as a whole. The new or updated duties of the FAC, so it's worth noting that they have new duties regarding the use and reporting of the funds provided. So as you all know, FACs are receiving funding this year, and that comes up in a later slide, but they now have new duties around how to report on their spending. They will be monitoring the school improvement plan, so rather than having a really active role in the establishment of it, it's more of a monitoring of the school improvement plan, participating in the provincial and regional meetings, consultations and professional development opportunities. So we will be trying to provide more opportunities for SACs to get together regionally, hopefully provincially, and to provide them with some professional development opportunities. So they should be participating in those opportunities as they come up. It's worth noting that the SACs no longer have a role in the hiring of the school principal, as was stated in the previous Education Act. They will have a role in terms of providing input on what kinds of characteristics they would like to see in the successful candidate for the principalship. So they're no longer required. They no longer have a duty to sit on the interview committee, but they will have input into what they would like to see in that leadership role for their school. And they also no longer have a role on the discipline committee, which was something that we heard loud and clear when we went around in the spring and did our focus groups, was that wasn't a role that SAC members were comfortable in. So that pretty much covers everything for that slide. Are there any questions so far?
Karen, I do. It's Scott.
Yep.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yep.
Okay. On the new updated duties section, you did mention the hiring of the principal and the role of the discipline committee, but the school advisory councils are also mentioned on the class cap guidelines that we use for September 30th each year.
Okay.
And they're mentioned where class may have to go over established caps that the teacher and the school advisory council need to agree.
Okay, so I don't know if I haven't. I have the regulations here. Do you know if that's still noted in the ministerial regulations, the new ones?
No, so these are class cap guidelines that I don't believe are in the regulations, but the guidelines that we use, and they're published by the department.
Okay, so yeah, so that would be, if that was a previous role that they had, then that would continue forward. It was really, and we didn't hear anything at those focus groups around that duty specifically. It was more about the discomfort in sitting on the interview panel and on the discipline committee. But I see Stephen has a comment, so you can go ahead, Stephen.
Sure, thank you. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Are you able? Yes, thank you. I think that even though that's not specified or laid out in the regulations, when you look at section 75G, where it talks about undertaking any responsibilities assigned by the minister or the regional center, in addition to the responsibilities set out in the school advisory council agreement, I think it would probably be wise to not add that within the SAC agreement as a duty, because one never knows, that could change from year to year because it's not specified or spelled out in the regulations, but that could be a duty that's and it's traditionally been there in response to Scott's question, but it's not completely spelled out. So it's just a personal professional opinion. I would probably not spell it out in the SAC agreement, but would that, if that still is from year to year, well, that could be brought forward to the SACs.
Good point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great point. Thanks for that, Stephen. Okay. So we will move on to the next slide around the SAC handbook. So the handbook is a fairly significant document, so it's not something that you'll have time to go through page by page at these meetings, but it's really just to let them know that the handbook has been revised to reflect the recent changes to the Act and the regulations, and to the structure of school board / regional centers. So one thing, as I previously mentioned, they will have to update their school advisory council agreements. Appendix A in the handbook provides a template for them to do that. We are asking that they submit their updated agreements by March 31st, 2019. That's a soft deadline. It's more just to give them a target, just to get them moving on that. It shouldn't be too onerous given the template that's available, but just to highlight that. And then the establishment of bylaws. So if they want to revisit their current bylaws and update those as well while they're updating their agreement, they can do that as well. And there are templates around bylaws in the handbook as well. And then if there's anything else that you think is relevant or worth pulling out that you want to mention when discussing the handbook, at the meetings I've been to, they've provided a copy of the updated handbook on the tables for people to flip through if they wanted to. So that was helpful. And to mention also that it's currently in a draft version, the updated handbook. So if they do have feedback on the handbook that they would like to provide, if you want to go to the next slide, they can send that along, and we're asking them to send it along to the regional centers for you to collect and then provide to us here at the department. We are going to put the handbook through our publishing department here for revision. So ideally, I didn't put a deadline on this, but if you want to also say for March 31st, then any updates that or feedback I've received by them, we can incorporate before giving it over to publishing, because we really want to have it fairly finalized before they start to go through it. So maybe between the regional meetings ending, sometime early in the new year, just to remind SACs if they have any feedback once they've been using the handbook, that they can send that along, and you can provide the correct email address on the slide there. And also just to encourage SAC members to really look through the handbook and review it, and to encourage their other SAC members to do the same, to familiarize themselves with it, because it really is meant as a tool for them to help guide their work. So just really encouraging them to use it and to review it and to look at the appendices and the tools that are available for them. So the funding, oh, Sherman, would it be better to get feedback sooner than later? Absolutely. So Sherman's asking if it would be better to get feedback sooner, so by the end of January as opposed to the end of March. That would be great for us. The sooner the better is definitely the case. I just wanted to make sure that we were giving enough time for SACs to have to use and refer to the handbook and to do their work, to maybe notice if there's any shortcomings or anything that's missing or anything they would like to see changed. So certainly we can encourage them to get feedback in as soon as possible, but likely I'll hold off until probably March before sending it along to publishing, just to make sure that we're able to get as much feedback as possible from the SACs and to give them an opportunity to really use it in their work. So the funding, this slide essentially captures what's been provided in the one-page handout that's gone out on funding for SACs. So the important thing on this slide to note is that the funding is intended to be spent in the current school year and not to be carried over to subsequent years. So that's worth highlighting for the participants. That this funding will be managed the same way as other school funds, such as student support grants. And what's happened at some of the meetings I've been at is that they go over this slide about the funding, and then they allowed people in small groups to talk about what they might want to spend the money on within their own SAC, and that's generated some great conversation. People have gotten good ideas from each other, and it's also allowed us to provide some additional clarification for questions that have come up. At one meeting, someone was saying that, because you'll see the categories of expenditure include supporting the school improvement plan, supporting policy development and implementation, and covering operational expenses. So someone was saying that it shouldn't be the job of the SAC to support policy development, that would be the job of the department. And the response to that is not that it's about necessarily promoting the policy, that there's a new policy, but it can be to support the implementation of that policy. So a great example that came up was around the school attendance policy. So if there was a school where students were arriving late and the SAC wanted to work with the Ecology Action Center to get a walking school bus happening, that SAC funds could go to support that initiative. So it's really about implementing things that might support a policy. So if you get any questions about that. And for the operational expenses, so it says up to 20% can be used to cover operational expenses of the SAC. This is really intended, again, to promote participation in the SAC. So if people would like to participate but can't because they don't have a babysitter, they don't have transportation, if providing a meal would help to get people out, that's the kind of thing that the operational expenses can be used for. And then some people say, wow, like 20%, that's $1,000 just for operational expenses. So it's up to 20%. They don't have to spend 20% on operational. It's their choice, but they have that option. And just to remind them, they do have to report back on everything that they've spent the funding on. So they have to be comfortable justifying all of their expenses. Any questions around the funding slide or anything else before we move on? Oh, also to note on the funding, just they will have to report on it, as I've mentioned. So there is a template available in the SAC handbook for an annual report. And the annual report essentially asks them to report on their activities for the year and how they've spent the funding broken down into those 3 categories. So they can refer back to the handbook to see that template, but that will be due by the end of the school year. So the policy consultation. So at the sessions I've attended, I've done this section, and at other meetings, other department representatives, REOs have taken on this section. So any sessions I'm attending or a department person is attending, you can expect them to take on this role. But essentially, this is the primer for them to get into a little bit of discussion around the consultation on the extracurricular policy. So this slide just helps to set up context for people about where policy falls in the hierarchy of legislation. So It's just a high level to go over that there's acts, regulations, policies, and then procedures and guidelines. And starting with acts, those are the most difficult to change, that they are legislation and that breaching them would create a legal liability. Regulations fall under acts. They also can have legal repercussions. And then once you get into policies, there can be provincial policies, which is what we're going to be consulting on at these sessions. And then there's also regional policies. And they are, the thing to note here is that policies are high level, they're broad statements. They're sort of the what do we believe about this topic, and then it's the procedures and guidelines that really get into the how are we going to do this, because people can get hung up on the how when that's really not the intention of the policy. The policy is sort of the broader overreaching statements about the topic. So an example that I've been giving is that a policy may be that every school should have a fire safety plan, and then the procedure would be that the teacher must close the door behind them when evacuating the classroom. So that just sort of sets people up in terms of giving them a little bit of knowledge about policy, and then we get into talking about the supervision of extracurricular activity policy that we're asking them to consult on. So there is a one-page summary document that we've been providing to SACs that highlights the policy. And some of that information is covered here on this slide, just sort of what the policy is about and the guiding principles behind that policy. To note that this is a provincial policy. And I've also been noting that there is a group that's looking at policies across the province to see where we can combine and have like more consistent policies across the board. So this is sort of the first of what I expect will be many times that we tap into the knowledge of the SACs to consult with us on draft policies. So I just wanted to note that for them as well. And then the next slide shows some guiding questions. So we have set these guiding questions out in an online survey, and there is a second handout that we've provided called like the guidelines for consultation. And what that document is intended is for principals and SAC chairs to take back to their next SAC meeting and help them to guide their SAC through this consultation activity. The survey link, it's worth noting, requires a GNSPES account to access. So the principal or one of the teacher or staff SAC members would have to log in for them to access the survey. The deadline that we've put for feedback, we've asked for December 21st, the last day before Christmas break. However, if an SAC won't be meeting between the regional meeting date and December 21st, we're happy to receive their feedback in January or whenever their next meeting is. We just, again, for us, the sooner the better to receive that feedback. We also want to highlight that we want to have two-way communication on this. So we will receive their feedback. Once they complete that survey, that feedback will come straight to the department, and we will use it to modify and update the policy itself. And we will provide a summary back to SACs on what we heard from the feedback that they provided and how it was incorporated, or if it wasn't incorporated, why it wasn't, so that they know that, you know, this is what we heard, this is what we did, so that they get that sort of full feedback loop in terms of they give us the information and then we report back on how it was used. So what we've been doing at the meetings I've been to is giving people time in their small groups to start having discussions around these questions. We haven't been collecting their responses necessarily. It's more just to give them the opportunity to start thinking about these questions and then going back to their own SACs and having these discussions and then filling in their feedback through the online survey. And where this is our first time doing a policy consultation with SACs, it's sort of our trial run. So if this sort of a model works, where we have an online survey link and we provide them with materials, and then they fill in the survey. If that seems to work well, that's probably the model we'll move forward with. But again, it's trial and error at this point. And it's worth noting, so once you've held your regional meeting, it'll be important to send out that policy summary document and the policy consultation guide to any principals of the schools that were in attendance so that they can start to move forward with the consultation. So just to make sure that they have those materials available if their SAC meeting is coming up in the near future after the regional meeting. Okay.
Can I? Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just
Go
want
ahead,
to make
Steve.
Thank you. I just want to make a comment from what we heard and I had discussed with you, Karen, was in that policy that they, the ones who will be doing these sessions, and I will be attending several more sessions, that there is under that one sheet policy, the summary, under the directives, there are those 2 bullets and then that line that presents as being confusing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. I have it here. Just grab it. So yeah, what Stephen's right. So at some of the sessions that I've been to and he's been to, there is a line on the policy summary document under the directive section where it says a principal or designate may assign responsibility for the supervision of extracurricular activities to, and then there's 2 bullets, an employee of the RCE or CSAP, and a volunteer as defined by this policy. And then the line right below that says, the principal cannot limit supervision to one of the above groups or the other. And people have been saying that they find that line confusing because it essentially sounds like the principal can designate to one of these 2 groups, but then it says that they can't limit it to one of those 2 groups. So we will be changing that language so you can reassure anyone at your session that brings up that concern that will be changed. But essentially what that line is intending to say is that the principal can't decide that they're not going to allow any volunteers or that they're not going to allow any employees to supervise extracurricular activities. So if there's a group, a team that wants to have an event and there's no employee, for example, available to supervise, but there is a volunteer available, the principal can't really limit supervision by saying, no, we don't allow volunteers to supervise. Now, it's up to the principal's discretion in terms of comfort level of allowing volunteers for certain activities, but yeah, they can't limit the supervision. So that line is confusing and that will be changed, so you may get questions on that. It's also worth noting that it's come up at some of the sessions I've been to that, well, what was the previous policy on extracurricular activities? So, for example, in Halifax, there wasn't a supervision of extracurricular activities policy. They had some guidelines. So this wasn't replacing an existing policy, it was a new policy. And just to know that there's other policies, regional policies that likely will link to this. So I'm sure every region has a policy around what checks a volunteer has to go through to volunteer at a school. In Halifax, it's called the Student Protection Policy. So that came up as a question, well, what checks do volunteers have to go through? So if there's any other regional policies you think that link to this, like the one that outlines what checks a volunteer has to go through, it's worth bringing those up as well, because that's come up in question at a couple of the sessions I've been to. Okay. Thanks for bringing that up, Stephen, and allowing me to clarify that. So the last item agenda is around communication. So this slide is intended to show sort of the flow of communication within from SACs, both up and sort of down the chain. So what we're encouraging with this visual is that SACs, if they would like to communicate to the regional center or the department, that communication would flow through the principal, and for those messages to go up to the region or the department. And then the other side of that is showing that the principal or the SAC may choose to communicate directly with the school community. And interestingly, at one of the sessions I was at, it was noted that we're missing another bubble that says SACs communicating with other SACs. So I may end up modifying this graphic in future to show that as well. But yeah, so the key message on this slide is that communication flow, especially when it goes up the chain, goes through the school principal. And then the last slide is asking the oh, Scott, you have a question? Go ahead.
Okay. This is just back on the former slide. I think it's important to note that let's say you are parents on the SAC, you should consider the responsibility that you need to communicate with other parents as well. So the group that you're representing, the group that you were elected from or appointed to represent, if you're sitting on the SAC and there's a matter being discussed, there might be a particular matter where you need to go back to your population to get input, because it's not just about your opinion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so, and hopefully that's captured in the arrow that goes from the SAC to the school community. So yeah, allowing the SAC to both go back to the school community to receive feedback and bring it back to the SAC and the principal, and maybe communicate it further up the chain. But you're right, Scott, you would want to be encouraging SAC members who are parent representatives to go back to the other parents in the school community for additional feedback on certain topics, if that seems like an appropriate course of action.
I think it's important, but it's not always obvious. I've had, I think I attended 3 SACs where the representatives felt that they did not have that responsibility by the very nature that they were already elected and sitting there.
Okay, so yeah, so if you think at your session you want to make that especially clear, absolutely, I think that's an appropriate message to get through on this slide as well.
Thank you.
And the last slide is just one final activity. The graphic isn't fully showing up here, but it just says, what are your biggest concerns or challenges when it comes to communication? So this again stems from the focus groups we held in the springtime, where we heard SAC members saying that they had concerns mainly with communication from the department to SACs, that again, that feedback loop wasn't always closed, so they would, send feedback up and then not know if it was used or how it was used. But then it also came up that there were challenges even communicating out to their own school communities. So some of them didn't have access to websites to post their minutes or to share information with community members. So so this question has generated some interesting discussions at the sessions I've been at. If you want to provide some paper on the tables for people to write down their feedback on this question, and if you want to collect them, certainly that would be helpful, or even just to give them 10 minutes or so to discuss it, and if you want to bring it back to the larger group and ask what they were talking about and facilitate a larger group discussion, that would be good as well. So in the sessions I've been to, those 3 activities, talking about potential items to spend the funds on, talking about the discussion questions for the policy consultation, and talking about this communication question. They've all gone quite well. That all generated some good discussion. So there seems to be an appetite and from these groups to start engaging on these types of topics. So they've all gone well so far where I've been. So are there any questions or concerns about any of the content that I just covered, or anything you're concerned about leading up to your regional meeting? Scott, go ahead.
Thank you. And this is referencing actually the fourth slide that had the Education Act excerpt on it.
Yep.
Right. See the 100 at the bottom?
Yeah.
I want to make sure that this is clear. I understood in reading the act that until a new school advisory council agreement is entered into, all former school advisory council agreements or letters are maintained. So in this case, until a school advisory council updates your letter of agreement, they operate under the current conditions. Is that the way?
Yes, that's that would be true. So if a school has an existing letter of agreement and they've formed an SAC for this school year, that remains in place until they update their LOA to become a school advisory council agreement. And Sherman's just noted that the new regulations do allow for that to occur, for the current letter of agreement to stay in place until it's updated.
Okay, that's the way I read the regulations. This line is a little confusing to me. School advisory council established under the former act is continued until July 31st, 2018. So that's passed. Or replaced by a school advisory council or regional council established under this act, whichever is earlier. July 31st already passed. Am I reading that?
Yeah. Yeah. So your interpretation would be correct in that the school advisory council that is currently existing under the previous letter of agreement can remain that way until the school advisory council agreement is updated. I know that wording is confusing because, as you say, July 31st has already passed, but SACs have been instructed to sort of form as they normally would, and as part of that, they will update that agreement. So
that phrase is just a...
If you get any questions on that, essentially they're allowed to exist under their current letter of agreement until they update it using the new school advisory council agreement, which hopefully they will all do this year. Yeah.
Okay.
So Sherman says section 100 is Section 100 came into effect on April 1st, 2018. However, the regs give the ability to stick handle the Education Act.
Yeah, it's like
Section
72 of the regs, I think.
So this was when it came out on April 1st. So I agree that it reads as though if they didn't have it before July 31st, then their current their current SAC cannot be continued, but within the regulations, there's some wiggle room provided for them to continue on until that school advisory council agreement is updated.
That's the way I understand, yeah. Thanks.
Are there any other questions or concerns?
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I think there are two sections in the regs. That's the one, 72 is a good one to look at, and section 70 sort of flows through with what's on that 100 on that slide. Is that 69 talks about the July 31st, 2018 and was operating. But then when you go into section 70, subsection 1, the school advisory council must enter into an agreement with the regional center and the department that sets out all the following. So those were with boards and with ECD, the previous ones, and I think that section 70, subsection 1, does indicate that there's an obligation to establish an agreement with the regions.
Yes.
Mhm.
And 72 talks about
Yeah.
one remains in place until the new one is agreed to.
Yeah. Until a new school advisory council agreement is entered into, a school advisory council established under Clause 69 to replace one that was established under the former Act, operates under the same terms and conditions, and has the same composition as set out in the predecessor school advisory council's agreement under the former Act. So,
And just to add, I think that when you look at 72 and 69, at 72, you couldn't say, well, we're just going to keep on going for years, because 70 does say that they must enter into an agreement with the regional center.
Yes.
So there is that obligation to look at establishing a new agreement.
Yes.
oh, and one question that did come up at the sessions that I've been at was, do they need to update their school advisory council agreement every year? And the answer is no, they don't have to update it every year, but they should review it and just make sure that it's still in line with how they operate. And if anything's changed, then they would want to update it. But once this new school advisory council agreement is in place, it would just be something they would want to revisit annually, just to look it over, and only update as necessary when things change. Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, well, I thank you all for joining me online today, and I will see some of you next week at your sessions, and everyone else, I wish you good luck at your sessions, and I look forward to debriefing on our next teleconference in December. And I will post this recording, so if you have anyone in your region that will be leading sessions that wasn't able to attend today, they can log on and have a look through the presentation and go from there. So again, if you have any other questions or concerns that come up afterwards, feel free to call or email me, and I will talk to you all soon. Thanks.
Thank you.